about your early morning swims?
Could you? They're not that interesting. I go up and down with a load of old ladies.
That's the start. Okay,
I need some context.
you just said before we started recording that you meet some old ladies at 7:00 in the morning.
I do.
You do.
Yeah.
And you undertake a peculiar activity, as many of us would consider it.
Well, it's not that odd. I derobe and then I go swimming.
Okay.
I must say, with swimming trunks on.
That's not quite the whole story, though, is it? Because you don't go to the local swimming baths.
No, it's outside swimming.
Outside swimming in an unheated
pool.
Up and down.
Which is very warm. It's actually 21 degrees today.
That's not even.
Which everybody who goes, oh, it's too hot. It's too warm. This isn't proper swimming outdoors.
But I'd think that was pesky cold if I got into 21 degree water. It's not like bath water, is it?
I don't know what the temperature. I was thinking this morning, what is the temperature of a heated pool? I don't know how hot they get.
Yeah, I'm guessing sort of high 20s maybe.
Yeah.
I think the sea is about 15, 16 in the summer, 17.
Yeah.
Anywhere you are.
I mean, it got down to. Yeah, I don't mean to brag or anything. It's down to about 2 degrees in the winter.
I've got a question for you. How do you know when someone's been cold water swimming?
They tell you.
I'm sure I've had before.
Well,
Before we get too far down this particular blind alley, well done anyway for getting up early and doing some cold water swimming with your old ladies.
I might add, your good lady wife was there. So
keeping an eye on you, that's what it was.
Yeah, probably.
Keeping you behaved.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, should we do a podcast?
Yeah.
Save us from this madness. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast, brought to you by Wellmeadow. Every week we try and come up with some interesting or useful stuff for you to consider as an owner or a manager of a small and medium-sized enterprise. And with me to pontificate over the latest subject, whatever that is Richard.
Hello.
Hello. That's short and sweet.
It was.
He's here.
It's that
See, now this is one of those afternoon recordings. We don't have beer, so we're fueled by this morning's caffeine that's starting to fade, and this afternoon's tea.
Aqua VT.
Indeed. So, last 3 episodes, just to give people a bit of orientation then. How did we get here? So, what did you do last week?
Last week, we had a guest on, Darren Palatina, who is a LinkedIn guru. And also, because we were sort of capping off June's Men's Mental Health Week, he actually has a really good story about his time in the armed forces and PTSD and how he got over that and that type of thing. So we tied that into his kind of expert knowledge of LinkedIn. So some very good handy tips on that if you want to use LinkedIn to grow your profile, business, etc.
That's good. I think it's fair to say that's changed our view a little bit as well, just updating a lot of it we knew about, but it's a reminder, isn't it, of what you should be doing, good practices.
Yep.
The week before that we talked about power. That was inspired by the Harvard Business Review article, wasn't it, and your 5 types of leadership.
5 types of power
training
in an organisation. And it was pitfalls of power, wasn't it? It was traps you can fall into when you are in a position of power.
Yeah, inevitable in some of them, but you have to be aware of them so you can manage them.
Yeah.
And then the week before that was episode 74. This was about how much of your marketing you should outsource. So assuming you're trying to do as much as you can and trying to aim for some sort of reasonable percentage of turnover for your marketing, it always exceeds what an internal department can achieve. So what would you choose to outsource more, wouldn't you? And thanks to Simon, who this morning told me that he'd been watching that from beginning to end on the YouTube. I found it very useful.
Well, there we go.
So that's another viewer we've got.
Viewer.
We're going up in the ones. Very good. So I'm glad you like that, Simon. So this week then, you may well have already scanned down the list of episodes and alighted upon this one. And it's about managing a crisis.
Yep.
Now, I'm not saying that we have lots of crises, but we've certainly been at clients and we've been around or near when they've happened in various guises. So we thought it'd be useful to draw on some experiences and just to try and get people to think again beyond, maybe they're not even doing risk assessments and risk registers, at least do those. But if even if you've done that, maybe think about what your crisis management action plan would look like. Because I bet you most people in SME worlds anyway, listening to this, either haven't got one at all, or if they ask their quality person, they'd say, yes, here you go, boss, here it is. And actually it's barely worth the paper it's written on. Not to disparage the people who put it together, but they're very hard to get in a form.
Yeah, it's very hard not to do a tick box exercise, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, I challenge anybody listening to just go and Google now what should be in a crisis action management plan. And it'll probably say, do a risk assessment, look at each thing on the list and come up with a plan and write it down. Which isn't very useful, is it really?
No, I suppose slightly adjacent to this is you should never waste a crisis.
Ooh,
that's the...
Okay. That was a Jack Welchism, wasn't it, from the GE days?
Yeah, it could have been. Or Philip Kotler, is he the change management guru? It's one way of driving change, isn't it? Is to use a crisis or create a crisis.
Well, Khalid told me that yesterday. Understand the pain.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to drive the change unless the pain of change is lower than the pain of staying the same. So understand the pain. So that was very good. Thanks, Khalid, for that little one. Build that into our conversations when people are moaning about stuff. But anyway, as you say, don't waste a crisis. And that's after the event. So that's about lessons learned and making sure that change has got a higher impetus. But today's episode really is more about something's just happened. You've just had the phone call or the alarm's gone off or whatever. What do you do? And it's easy to sort of freeze in the moment if you haven't at least thought about this a little bit before. Now, maybe you've got some seasoned veterans in the business and they've seen it all before and been around the block and it's all very calm and everything, but usually that's not the case. And everybody's got to handle their first crisis once, haven't they? So I thought it would be useful just to go through the basics.
Yep.
And sort of a bit of a morbid start, really, but I thought we'd better get this sort of out the way, if you like. If it is the most serious of crisis, which is a fatality, and we have been around one of those where one of our clients did very unfortunately suffer a fatality of one of their employees. As it happens, it wasn't on their site, was it? It was one of their customers' sites. Yeah. It was somebody who was working remotely. But nevertheless, the company had to manage the fatality situation. Now, all the obvious things you'll know about, administering the first aid, calling the emergency services and that sort of thing. But the key thing about that is to make sure you've retained the scene in the state it was when you found it. So be very careful that because this is now potentially an investigatory scene of some sort, you've got to be mindful of what might be around as evidence. So, sort of get that one out of the way. And then if you haven't done it already, call emergency services. So a lot of these things are obvious and will happen anyway. People, common sense will tell people to deal with the absolute immediate aftermath of a crisis, if it's that sort of nature, if you've had an explosion on the shop floor or whatever. But oftentimes the crises that we come across aren't anywhere near as dramatic as that. They're just something that has an impact, maybe a financial impact, rather than danger to life and limb. So it's what happens really once you've dealt with that bit, the safety of people and the investigatory stuff and calling the emergency services. It's what do you then do? And I'm assuming that the scenario we're talking through here is a big enough crisis that it warrants this sort of response. It's not customers rung up with a bit of a moan, or something like that. It's something else. So step one, get your crisis response team together. And I don't know in the clients you've worked with and the ones that we know about, who would be on that team. How big does it have to be? You don't need too unwieldy, do you? You don't want to be waiting forever till they'll get together. It's got to have at least the person responsible involved.
I think, I don't know where we've seen these before, and maybe different industries take a different view of this. Maybe manufacturing takes it a little bit more seriously than perhaps some of the legal clients we've dealt with, because you're not so likely to have a crisis that involves machinery or things like that. But a lot of the time, and I think this back to that point before, the danger of this becoming a tick box exercise is so real, because you make this plan and you just put names in of, normally it's, if we're talking about an SME, most of it's just going to be people on the board, isn't it?
Yeah.
So their names, or it's almost like insert owner / partner / director into crisis plan. But they may not be the best people, so it's worth having a think.
Well, that's true, and allocating those roles appropriately. So even though you'd probably want to make sure it's called from the most senior person, or that even if they're not available, the most senior person available is calling there. And then I suppose you have a series of handovers that as the more senior person arrives or is available, maybe they're on holiday or something, or at a client, then they sort of take over control, whoever the most senior person is. So you still need somebody who's the sort of lead contact or the lead driver, the manager of the crisis response team. But a lot of the work won't be being done by that person.
I think before we looked at it, I have to remember the top of my head, you have like a gold team, silver team, bronze team. And so gold team would be your most senior people who maybe they're not, like you say, they may not be at the scene at the time or whatever. So whoever's in the silver team takes charge, but when the gold team gets there. And then each team can have different responsibilities to do things as the crisis unfolds or kind of the ripple effect of it happens. So
I think that's a good point. And there will be different roles that either different teams in that scenario or different people will need to have allocated to them.
Yeah.
And it's unlikely that even if you'd written this policy down, that everybody's going to remember that in the face of a crisis. So whoever is the head of the silver team in your scenario there, or the gold team when they're on site, they at least need to know where to go to get this. Maybe have it in their phone, maybe have it on the LAN or something, but it's obviously, or even just remember it. But you've got to have a few basics in place right at the very beginning. And the first thing, having called that first team meeting, is allocate those responsibilities and agree what the meeting schedule is going to be. And I would suggest that that first meeting needs to be very short, because it could well be that there's loads of really immediate things that need to be getting on with. And the last thing you want to do is to give people an excuse to hide from the reality of what's going on by saying, oh, I was in the emergency response team meeting. Yeah. So, 5 minutes, everyone's here. We're going to meet again in 2 hours time or the end of the day or whatever it is. You do this, you do that, you do the other, I'll do this. Okay, everyone go, brilliant, off you do things. So you've got to have somebody who's prepared to take control at that point and presumably not give themselves too many tasks to do themselves. They need to be able to stand back and react to situations and watch what's going on.
Yep.
So that's where they'd often say, activate the plan. And I bet you
plan.
Most people don't have a plan, or if they do, they pick it up and it says, do a risk assessment. And it's a bit past that.
One thing we've talked about before, and we got reasonably close to implementing, but I don't think we ever quite executed, was to almost have a kind of grab bag or go bag for a crisis situation that might have the names of people who are on the team, the phone numbers, even high-vis vests that are different colour. Maybe not gold, silver, bronze. That might be a little bit, but red, green, yellow, or whatever they are. Yeah, just so you can designate responsibilities and
certainly for a physical response. Clearly, it's something different here if there's been subcontractor failure or something on site. But to be ready for those on the site physical ones, the idea of some high-vis jackets and whatever you want to put.
I just quite like the idea of a grab bag. To be honest.
You want a grab bag?
It brings out the prepper in me.
How many days of food you can store for this? But that's a lesson that comes, I do a bit of sailing, and that's something that sailors have to have ready. You always need your grab bag, and if you're out on passage somewhere, you need to have your passports in it because you don't know where you're going to be rescued to, and you probably need a knife and a torch and your handheld VHF radio and stuff. So you've got to work out what would I need in an emergency of that nature. But thankfully, the sorts of crises that we come across are very rarely of that physical, in the moment, denies access, cordon off the area type nature. It clearly can happen, and it's as well to have a plan for when it does.
Well, we're 9 meals from anarchy, so just remember that. You heard it here first.
Exactly.
Be prepared.
So I think then we've already talked about the safety point, if there's injury involved. But I think the point here is about stopping the situation getting worse. So if there are, affected parties, whether injured or customers having products delayed or whatever, they are on your radar already. You're dealing with them. But the very next thing is, how much worse could this get? So if, for example, there's a situation that triggered today's discussion, really, where there's been a supplier failure, how many other products are also going to be held up by that supplier? So one of the potential end customers has raised the balloon and they know it's happening. How many other problems are about to come out the woodwork? So have a look at that. On a site, we talked this before about a manufacturing site with the evacuation. It's not just about the evacuation. How do you stop the next shift coming on site? So as well as getting the current people out, go and station someone at the entrance, turn them around and get the message out through the
don't make the problem worse type of thing.
Don't let the problem come worse. And similarly for people in a more product environment, they may be familiar with the 8D process for automotive use. And one of the first steps in that is to quarantine the problem. Once you define the problem, stop it getting worse. All the affected parts that might be, you don't know yet, but might be affected, quarantine them until they've been inspected. So you've got to take a sort of safety first, worst case first approach.
Yep.
Get everything protected so it can't get any worse. Because if you don't do that first, then just when you're trying to fix the first bit that's happened, more fires are starting to go off left, right, and centre.
Yep. So I suppose then the next stage is around information gathering, situation assessment.
Yeah.
And I suppose having the right, you need the right people and the right systems in place to be able to do that, don't you? You've got to make that, like you say, you make that assessment. Are we at the peak of the crisis? Is there more to come? Are we is it over?
I think one of the jobs of that crisis team that's going to be meeting quite regularly, maybe to start with, they're meeting every couple of hours or at least twice a day or whatever it is, they've got to agree what's their comms channel. What are they going to use? So you don't want some people texting, somebody else WhatsApping, someone else sending an email, someone else using a Teams chat. You need to somehow keep all this together so that everyone can be informed that needs to be. And the other lesson we learned for some of the more serious crises that we've been around is get everybody disciplined and tell them in that first meeting that all the events they witness or all the communications they make, you've got to note them with a timestamp. So if you received a call or saw something or you made a call or sent a message, you've got to keep a log, time-stamped log of what's going on so that after the event you can both learn from it, but of course depending on how serious it is, there may be more serious investigations around this sort of thing. Yeah, so keeping records and collect the data as you go along.
Was there something around copying in lawyers as well?
Well, that was something that cropped up at one particular client, yes, and I think it was possibly overplayed, but there is a valid element to it, which if you get your lawyers involved early on, and clearly one of the early things you may well have to do, even if you're just wanting to alert them early on to maybe defend against some sort of claim against consequential losses or something like that. But it might be more serious, especially if you've had personal injury or whatever it may be, some sort of claim against a supplier. The point that was made was that if you copy them in earlier on, then you're subject to your communications are protected by some sort of legal client privilege. And just taking a bit of advice on that, and we're obviously not lawyers, so we're not giving this advice, but it would appear that has got a relatively limited amount of protection.
Right.
And it only applies if the communication you're asking the lawyer to be involved in and copied in is actually asking for legal advice.
Yep.
You can't just copy them in and then just talk to your other board members about whatever's going on. That wouldn't be protected. But even if you are asking for legal advice, you have to clearly state that in the email, I'm asking for legal advice. And it's protected because it's confidential, so you have to also say that it's confidential and not overly share that. So don't copy everyone on the response team if you don't need to. Don't forward the responses. That's going to show that you're not treating the confidentiality strictly, so nobody else will. So there is certainly something about involving the lawyers earlier on and copying them in, certainly when they're being asked for advice.
Yep. Internal communication?
Yes, and I think if you were to think about all the things that go wrong with crisis management, communication, internal, external, whatever, is usually the bit that people pick up on as the failure. There's probably all sorts of other failures beneath the surface, but the one that people see or experience the lack of or badly done is the communications. And you're right to split that between internal and external and do the internal bit first. You've got responsibility to the people immediately affected, which could well be the customer as well, the directly affected one, but the people inside your company that are going to have to deal with it, they need to know that you're on this, that there's a response team in place, that there's regular communications happening, and we will update you X frequently.
I think maybe a lot of businesses have this bit reasonably well sorted just because of COVID. That probably, even though that we were just talking before, weren't we, that the first couple of days of COVID was all so unprecedented. Yeah. That I think I was already self-isolating at that point.
You do that half the time anyway. You're a recluse.
Exactly. It's quite nice.
It suited you down to the ground.
Exactly. But yeah, so I think a lot. But having those internal comms around, what's the situation about coming into the office, out of the office, who's coming in, who's not coming in. I think a lot of businesses probably got that nailed, but that wasn't particularly I suppose it was a crisis in a sense, but it became so ongoing that those procedures, it was quite easy to
I think we'll come on to that in terms of the sort of business continuity bits. Where do you work, how do you work, what's your laptop? But this first bit you've got to agree on right at the outset is how are we going to communicate to the internal people? Are we going to use whatever, use Teams or Slack or something to start with? Are you going to be emailing everybody? Are you going to put a dedicated web page up with a password on it for just the internal people? Are you going to brief your people to say, look, please, this is for internal use only. We will manage external communications separately, so please respect that. You've got all that to manage in. And you also need to have some provision for handling inbound. You're not just going to be having all your employees sat there waiting for more news. Some of them are going to be desperate for more news, depending on the nature of the problem. So you've got to have a point of contact.
Yeah.
So you may well decide to split this all up and have, say, HR, if you have an HR person, be the point of contact for internal comms, and external comms might be a sales or marketing person, maybe. So you've got to work out what's the best split.
And you probably need to check that people have actually got the message as well, isn't it? It's all well and good putting something out on Slack or something if people haven't actually checked it or read it. So actually having that physical, you see that sort of cascade.
Yeah,
approach.
I think that's where your hierarchy comes into play, doesn't it? Every manager checks on their department and goes down through the system. So you're certainly getting that internal stuff set up, work out what the channel is, and keep it regular. Even if you don't think you've got anything new to add, say something anyway, just to say there's nothing new to add. You've been working all day, we're waiting on this. As per the last communication, we're still ongoing. So people then get used to that rhythm of updates, even if the update isn't updating very much.
And you can kill a lot of speculation as well, can't you? Because that's another, I suppose, spin-off consequence of some of these things.
And I think, like I said earlier about the immediately impacted customer, I would include them in this very early phase because they have got a different level of interest to other stakeholders. But I would also include that if you've got an injured person involved, that person may not be the person you're communicating with. They may be undergoing treatment, or in worst case, they may not be around. So we have to consider the family or next of kin of the people that we are, also having to communicate with. So there's this first phase, and there'll be a different way of communicating clearly with them. The other thing that brings into play is how much of this is in person. And I think there's a balanced judgment to make from the overall leader of the organisation. Do they front this up? Do they attend, whether it be the customer that's been affected, the injured person in hospital, the family, or whatever, or workers and colleagues? How much are they the face of this, and how much are other people better suited to do that while they organise it? And there's a real balance, I think, because it's a difficult job. Someone's got to do it, and I think this is where the leader should instinctively step up. Captain is the last one off the ship type of thing. Exactly.
So I suppose after internal comms, external communication strategy, and this is not necessarily, I suppose, who's going to be the spokesperson? Is it going to be somebody, like you say, is it the leader? That's probably valid for certain things, but they can't do everything. So
they're going to get quickly swamped if they have to do that as well. Yeah.
So do you go external and get a PR company? And that doesn't necessarily mean you've got to have one on retainer, but you could be looking around and thinking, right, let's imagine a scenario.
Yeah.
Who would we go to? Who could help us? So actually having that kind of on the horizon is probably no bad thing.
It's worth having had the call, isn't it? Just go on LinkedIn and see if you find PR agencies that advertise doing that sort of thing. Or maybe there's another crisis somewhere else and you see that being well handled. Yeah. There was certainly one learning point from the fatality example I gave earlier, where there are specialists out there who deal with companies that have fatalities. It's a very sad fact of life, I suppose, that there are industrial accidents every year. And thankfully, companies don't tend to have more than one of them. They're not very well rehearsed in it. So there are agencies that deal with that because they're more able to, take the emotion out of it and come up with the right process. Yeah. So that's good. I think with the external comms as well, you may not be ready to give a lot of information to start with, but at least give those interested in contacting you reassurance that you will be talking to them. Yeah. So this is the point of contact. This is the number to ring me on. We will proactively communicate, but if you have any questions, come to me. But this is probably different between B2B and B2C companies, isn't it? Because I think if you're a B2B company, you don't suddenly want to go to the press and tell everybody what's happened, for the purposes of general communication, because the audience that it matters to is reasonably small, and why damage your reputation amongst employees in the local community. But if you're a B2C and you've got a wide audience base, then different rules apply.
Yeah. So I suppose with both these things, having a clear plan is probably something that is worthwhile thinking about, putting that in place. Even like you say, communicating. If you haven't got anything to say, at least giving people a timeline of when you might be saying something, or so you just kind of get rid of that speculation and conjecture. Yeah. I suppose the other thing as well is from the external perspective, is to monitor what's going on. Yeah. So social media, local
especially
media.
these days with social media. Yeah,
So-
you'll have a lot of speculation, won't you, of things that people are wanting to say. It's like, you get in the news some terrible story, and all of a sudden you've got all these amateur sleuths coming up with
Yeah.
theories about what's happened, and I don't think generally it's all that helpful, but
Yeah.
it's something that I'm sure the police have to deal with.
But things like having Google Alerts is pretty simple nowadays, but
Yeah, it's true.
at least a Google Alert set up for your company that it's somebody in the crisis team has got access to,
Yeah.
or get your PR team or whoever to look at it. That might flag up if people are talking about you. But
Well, this is
maybe have
clearly where
someone's role.
marketing have a role.
Yeah.
They should be more plugged in.
Social listening,
It's all
there's
social
tools that
stuff.
can do that.
Exactly, do all that stuff. So that's on the comms, both internal and external. We mentioned legal bits earlier on, just to refer to that. If you haven't done it by now, then you need to inform your lawyers, but probably also the other stakeholders, maybe the bank or the other funders,
Yeah.
shareholders. If you're a listed company, you'll have to make a statement to the stock exchange,
Insurers.
insurance company. Yes, now insurance, there's a whole thing around insurance, isn't there, on this? Once again, they'll want to bring in their people early doors,
Yep.
loss adjusters. They'll be doing their own investigation, and clearly they're looking to see whether they are liable to cover the losses and so on.
Yeah.
But I think the lesson we learned from that, being up close to a company that suffered from it, was not in the crisis moment itself. It's too late by then.
Yeah.
It was quite how important getting insurance right is. And nobody likes paying for insurance. Nobody likes reading all the documents. But companies have gone under because they've been inadequately insured or didn't understand the terms of their own insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. Read the contract.
Yes, and make sure that if there are requirements stipulated specifically in it, remember it's your responsibility to know about them and to comply
Yeah.
with them. And it was one of those sad cases where it was a technicality around procedure, you could argue, which wasn't followed, but it did mean that a company that suffered an unfortunate fire ended up being uninsured.
Yep.
Very sad. Clearly, if there's been an accident, you may have to report it through the RIDDOR system and to Health and Safety Executive and all that sort of thing. So, you're starting to communicate now, not just to the customers externally, but to the stakeholders. Make sure that everybody is aware. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then customers, I suppose, we've got to start managing now the broader customer impact.
Yeah. So I suppose first off, you've got to assess who's actually been affected.
Yeah.
So, for example, this company that we work with who had a cyber incident, not everybody was affected. So there's no point, like you say, broadcasting it. If someone's, if someone's account or whatever hadn't been touched, then there's no legal obligation to talk about that. But you have to then isolate those ones who have been and take appropriate action.
Yeah.
Again,
right.
make the assessment.
I think the key there is getting on the front foot.
Yeah.
If you are slow about all of this, then the news will seep out eventually anyway. And if people have to contact you asking, they're in a much more agitated state. They've every reason to be more annoyed about the fact, because it gives the impression you're trying to hide it or hope it goes away or bury it under the carpet. So you've got to get on the front foot with these things. And if there's been a mistake, however there is through the chain, you need to acknowledge the appropriate amount of responsibility. And give people that comfort and awareness that you're on this. You're dealing with it. You've accepted that something needs to be done, and I'm doing it. We can argue the whys and wherefores about compensation and so on later on, but at least give a very clear statement that something's happened, you've been impacted, I understand that, we're dealing with it.
I have seen with that as well, they give kind of a dedicated customer helpline or something, which again, maybe something we're thinking about. Set up a Google number or something, so it's not your actual phone number, maybe
a different
it's
number,
not your actual business line that people are ringing, different number that could be diverted or whatever. But again, I think it just it gives that impression that this has been thought through. There's a special kind of team or something for people who've been affected by this situation, and it kind of ring fences it as well a little bit. Yeah,
sure. And you can just go and get yourself another phone from the local phone shop, can't you? It doesn't take long to get a phone set up, and you can be up and running fairly quickly. So I think the point there, and this happened recently with the incident that's triggered this as an idea for today's podcast, is when your customers are already getting very angry about the consequential effects of the problem, and they're starting to list financial numbers to you, but the problem's ongoing, then you need to sensitively acknowledge that that is a subject that will have to be discussed at some point, but really it might be more helpful if we could put that to one side for now while we focus on remediating the problem itself. I appreciate that everybody wants to get their fair balancing up at the end of it all, but it's going to be in everybody's interest to solve the problem first, rather than have our focus gone into lawyers and being careful, how we do stuff and all of that. Let's get the problem mitigated, corrected, get everyone back on an even keel, and then we'll have a discussion about who's liable for what and whose fault it was and what we're going to do about it. So I think that's the key point about all that. And then, of course, if you've got a longer term plan with the customers, then reassure them that at the end there'll be a wash up and some sort of lessons learned exercises, and we'll follow up with all that.
Kappa, corrective and preventative action.
Very good.
There you go. So I suppose then operational continuity, the show must go on, isn't it?
Well, that's what we talked about earlier with the COVID thing. And I think, thankfully, if there's a silver lining to that cloud, we've all got a lot better now of knowing how to just cope anyway somewhere else. Now, clearly, if you're running a factory with machinery on site, that's not quite as easy. But for the 80% of the economy that's the service economy, then yes, we're getting more used to laptops and working from home and even using your mobile to connect to the internet if you haven't got a network and that type of thing. So we're a lot more able to do that sort of things. But you still got to think about other stuff like traveling to clients if you need to, and where do you physically work from when you need to get together if you do need to do that.
Yeah, I think probably a lot easier for service businesses, isn't it? Like you say, if you've got plant and fixed equipment, things very difficult. I think as well, if you work in something like retail, you can't work from home, can you?
Yeah.
So it's I was following a debate on that on LinkedIn the other day. It's the whole, we can work from anywhere, anytime type of why not type of thing.
But that's not the whole economy.
No. Someone's got to stock shelves and sweep the streets.
Agriculture or retail or public services of that nature, frontline stuff. Yeah, that's difficult, isn't it? So there's all that stuff there. Financial management, I think this is now where hopefully you've gathered enough information that you can start to quantify the impact you're going to have on your own cash flow, first and foremost, then your profitability, and then your funding requirements. So if you've got some funders, you're going to have to talk to them, external funding, bank, invoice discounting, whoever it is that you use, you've got to make sure that you're familiar with all of that. HMRC are often very understanding in these situations. If you explain what's happened, they'll give you time to pay, and you can defer PAYE and VAT payments and that type of thing.
And I suppose, again, this maybe not the immediate crisis, but if this is inspiring people to think ahead and maybe do almost come up with a crisis and run through this scenario, role play it, for want of a better word. Things like if you've got key man insurance, that can be useful. We've seen that unfortunately had to be used in the past.
We have, yes, a very sad occasion. Yeah.
Things like death in service for people. All those kind of things that are actually quite easy to put in place, but before after the fact,
they're not that expensive when you consider the cost of having to deal with it in the moment and unprepared for. Exactly. So put those sorts of things in place. Same with healthcare. Lots of more companies these days do private healthcare just because you can get people back on their feet quicker.
And I think maybe just on the cyber thing as well, because having done some work with insurance companies, it's actually quite alarming how few people have or companies have cyber insurance. Less than 1% or something.
Something crazy,
or less than 3% or less than 1%. Some ridiculously low number.
Yeah.
And having seen close up when there's a cyber attack in a couple of places now, actually the insurance for that will often cover an element of the PR and also the investigation, which can run, if you have to do forensic investigation into cyber attack, that can run into 50, 60, 70 grand. But oftentimes that's covered under the insurance plus an element of PR in the mix as well.
And I was always quite cynical about that on the basis that surely if you've been, what do they call it, spearfished or whatever, where someone impersonates and gets you to pay. So it's a human, what do they call it, social engineering thing, don't they, where they get somebody to actively pay. So it's not like it's been hacked. They've got a person to do it deliberately, but under false pretenses. But apparently as long as you can show that you've put the right training in place and the procedures were there and still somebody fell for it, then you can still be covered by it. But anyway, we're not the salespeople for the cyber insurance.
No, but I think this is almost something like, this is crisis management before the crisis, isn't it?
Well, back to risk registers then, risk assessments. And I think in all of our board meetings, we always go through risk registers with people. But I do know that, people want to be rolling their eyes when I get to that bit because they feel that's the boring bit. Yeah. Can we just get on with reviewing the finances, talking about the sales and get out of here? Well, one of the key things that the board can do is to make sure that they've thought about the future. And that partly is the risk register. Yeah. But don't just go down listing a load of generic risks, flood, fire, pestilence, and key person leaving and that type of thing. And then just talk yourself into low scores and move on. Really seriously think about how would we cope with this.
Well, imagine how many companies have a strategy day or a couple of strategy days a year. What if you had a crisis day and you actually thought, right, okay, this morning we're going to have whatever crisis is going to impact our business and this afternoon we're going to have another one. And we're just going to pretend that that's happened. Yeah. And then
the emergency services do that from time to time. Coordinate how all the different services work together. So you're right, you could do it a bit like a fire drill, take a bit of time, wouldn't it? But if you planned that, even if it just took a couple of hours, say, right, let's just role play the first 2 meetings. It's just happened. Who's going to do what, right? Who calls where? What's the channel we're going to use for comms? Who's calling the lawyer? Have we got a PR agency number that we can ring? Someone pretends to ring.
That's why I keep saying to myself, I need to look at how to sort out a flat tire in my car.
You can't sort out a flat tire.
I can change the tire and things, but it's not. It's got the spray thing that you stick in and the solvent.
Because you haven't got a spare tire.
Because I haven't got a spare tire.
Yeah.
And so I keep saying to Saffron, we should, and I should do it with her car as well. Right before there's a crisis, because when you're at the side of the motorway in the dark, if you ever had to change a tire, in a country lane in the middle of the night or something, which I've had to do before, that's not the time to be trying to figure out where your locking nut is.
No.
So a stitch in time saves 9 type of thing.
Man overboard practice sailing.
Exactly.
Okay, so look, we're not experts in this sort of stuff by any means, but we've been around a few of these sort of examples, haven't we? So let's not be blasé about it. Let's just build this into our everyday work. Don't make a big fuss about it as if it's the most important thing. And I know how people regard this in terms of their priorities of everything else in business. But if for one moment in the year it's made you think a little bit about, well, what would we do then if the crisis struck tonight or tomorrow morning? At least who would be in my crisis team? How are we going to organise those meetings? Who does what? Who's the PR company if we're going to use one? Just some of those basics that we've mentioned about. And maybe at the very least, go and check your insurance and make sure that if there's any requirements in there, you're complying with them. Otherwise, you've just invalidated your policy because you didn't check you had the right locks on your windows or something crazy. All right?
Yep.
Useful?
I think so. There's a lot to digest in it, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think we should have a crisis day.
I think we need to think that through ourselves. Yeah. Take some of our own medicine.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we'll sure get some feedback from listeners on that. We're getting increasingly some feedback from people listening to our episodes, telling which ones they like more. So please do that. And also tell your friends, as we ask you every week, if you think this is sort of useful material that's worth prompting some discussions, either in your board or amongst your other business colleagues, then please let them know. Thanks again for supporting us and for continuing to listen and to share it. And in the meantime, good luck with your business.